We are very grateful that Mr. Lars Benjaminsen, who is related to the Danish National Center for Social Sciences in Copenhagen, accepted our invitation to give a lecture at this conference about a Danish policy on homelessness, children and young people. Mr. Benjaminsen will talk for about 40 minutes, and afterwards we can have a discussion, or people can ask questions for about 20 minutes. And at the end, Professor Bernard Hubo of the University of Antwerp will present some concluding reflections. But first, Mr. Benjaminsen, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation to come here and give a perspective from the outside on the issues you have been debating here today. We are indeed also debating homelessness a lot in Denmark, and I think we are facing many of the same challenges. One could say that we have not yet at least seen the same rise in family homelessness, but we've seen a general increase in homelessness, and especially we have seen an increase in youth homelessness that has caused a lot of concern in Denmark. And in my presentation here, I will just first give an overview of trends and profiles of homelessness in Denmark, and try to speak a bit also about the mechanisms behind these trends. And then I will say a bit about how we are preventing family homelessness in Denmark, and then talk a bit more generally about homelessness policies in Denmark, and especially the experiences from our national homelessness strategy. We've had quite a comprehensive national homelessness strategy in Denmark for the past 6-7 years, based on the Housing First principle. And at the end, I will address whether Housing First is also a good, suitable intervention for young homeless people, and also more broadly reflect a bit on housing-led approaches for homeless families. But first, I would just like to frame the talk a bit in our understanding of homelessness, and especially how homelessness relates to the nature of welfare systems, because it is quite evident that the patterns and profiles we are seeing in different countries on homelessness are very closely related to more general welfare and housing policies. The international literature on homelessness widely shows that in countries such as Denmark and Belgium that has quite extensive welfare systems, homelessness is widely concentrated to people with complex support needs. But we can also see that in countries with less extensive welfare systems, homelessness to a much wider extent also affects broader groups of poor people due to housing affordability problems. That means if we, for instance, compare Northern European countries to countries like the US and increasingly also Canada, we will see that homelessness in the US and Canada affects quite a larger group of people, and many more people with general poverty and housing affordability problems. And the point is, of course, that welfare systems are dynamic. European welfare systems are also under pressure, and we should be very aware and concerned about how some of the challenges and reforms that European welfare states are undergoing might also affect this balance on how wide groups of people are affected by homelessness. And this also leads me into a brief reflection on the factors and mechanisms behind homelessness. I think we often tend to have a quite individualized perspective on homelessness. But homelessness arises in an interaction between these individual risk factors that could be mental illness, substance abuse problems, weak social ties, etc., and the more structural and systemic factors. And we see indeed an increasing problem in almost all European countries is the increasing lack of affordable housing, especially in our cities, as a very big challenge, if you've also debated here today. On a more systemic level, the adequacy of welfare and housing benefits also to enable people to afford housing, and the extent of public housing systems and also targeted housing allocation systems is of crucial importance for shaping the nature of the homelessness problem. And then there is, of course, also the extent of social support systems. How well developed are support systems for people with complex needs? That's both for vulnerable families and especially, of course, also for single people with complex support needs. So it's an interaction on factors on many levels that shape the homelessness problem, and you can say that vulnerable people with psychosocial problems are those who are most likely to be affected by such adverse structural trends like increasing housing affordability problems. But that just to frame my presentation a bit. In Denmark, as I mentioned in the beginning, we have unfortunately seen an increase in homelessness in recent years. Since 2007, we have done biannual national homelessness counts. And since we started that, we've gotten a better picture of how homelessness has developed in Denmark. It is a quite extensive count that not only includes the homelessness service sector, but also includes more general welfare agencies like municipal social offices, job centres, treatment, addiction treatment, psychiatric treatment centres. So we get quite a broad picture from including all these services into the count on how homelessness in Denmark develops. And what we can see is that there is, unfortunately, a rising trend in homelessness. As you can see here, from 2009 to 2015, and that is actually the period where the Danish National Homelessness Strategy Program has been in operation, the number of homeless people has increased from 5,000 to about 6,000 homeless people. And that is in a population in Denmark of 5.7 million people. Quite comparable to Flanders, I think, a bit smaller, but somewhat similar. Rough sleepers are only about 1 out of 10 of homeless people in Denmark. The largest group are those who are at a given time in homeless shelters, but we also see a quite large group that are couch surfers staying temporarily with family and friends. And we see especially that it is in this group of couch surfers staying with family and friends that we see the increase in homelessness. And the underlying reason for that is that the increase that occurs is widely happening among young people, and they widely stay in this form of homelessness situation. We also see homelessness in Denmark is widely concentrated to our two largest urban areas, Copenhagen and Aarhus. And we have especially seen an increase in homelessness in parts of the Copenhagen area, namely the belt of suburban municipalities around Copenhagen, and then we have also seen an increase in Aarhus. And the reason behind this change is that the housing affordability problem in our larger cities is growing. It is now widely affecting the whole metropolitan area of Copenhagen, also increasingly the suburban municipalities out from the city. And we are also seeing that our second largest city, Aarhus, that previously had a housing market that were more similar to a bit smaller towns and cities, start to look more and more like the housing market in the capital. And what we are told out in the municipalities are that it is just getting increasingly difficult to get housing for socially vulnerable groups in particular. We face a growing housing shortage crisis in Denmark. Some of those who have been affected the very most by these changes are young people. We have seen, I think, a quite dramatic increase in youth homelessness in Denmark over this period. Especially in the first part of the period, as you can see here, an increase amongst the 18 to 24-year-olds. where we in the count in 2009 recorded about 600 young people in that age group, and that increased, almost doubled to 1,170 young people between 18 and 24-year-olds in 2015. So a dramatic increase in that age group. And then a bit later in the period, we have now also seen this increase starting to take place amongst the 25 to 29-year-olds, where we've seen an increase of about 60% or so over the period. And there are, of course, many different reasons behind such a change. It can be difficult to infer very specifically what is the causal mechanisms behind this. We see, for instance, a growing problem of hashish abuse amongst young, vulnerable people, especially amongst young, vulnerable males. But the most likely driver of this change is on a structural level, because about 10 years ago, welfare reforms started taking place of social benefits for young people, and social assistance benefits for young people were reduced, trying to give them a stronger incentive to seek education and employment. There were many good reasons for that, probably to motivate a bit stronger youth to get education and employment. But it looks as if this has had the negative consequence to push more vulnerable young people over the edge here and into homelessness. What we are hearing from the municipalities is that, especially for young people and these reduced benefits, vulnerable young people who also have many other problems than their homelessness, it has become very, very difficult to find housing for them that they can afford. So here is probably a quite clear link between the weakening of the welfare protection system in Denmark for this group and a quite strong increase in youth homelessness. Now, fortunately, we have not yet seen the same increase amongst homeless families with children, underage children. We have a very low level of family homelessness in Denmark, and we still have. It is about 11% of homeless women that were recorded in the count who have daily custody over children, and only 1% of homeless men. And then there are also a group both of homeless women and homeless men who have shared custody. But especially, only about 100 children were recorded as homeless in the last count, and that number has been quite stable over all the counts throughout the whole period. And as you can see, this is a quite lower number than the number we saw for Flanders earlier today. And most of these children are staying together with their parents. Very few are on their own, so to say. Most of them stay with a parent in a family shelter or in some form of short-term transitional housing, or they stay with a parent with family and friends. And why have we succeeded in maintaining such a low level of family homelessness? I think that the main explanations for this are mainly on a structural side in characteristics of the welfare and housing system in Denmark. First of all, we have a strong child welfare protection system that provides quite intensive social support for vulnerable families and children that widely can receive family therapy, support interventions, etc. And this is a very strong system. But as you see, the gap, so to say, happens when the children turn 18. That was also debated in this morning session for Belgium, that when they turn adults, then the gap, the slip is, so to say, where they transition into the adult welfare system that is not nearly as strong as the protection system for vulnerable children. But the main reason probably for this low level of family homelessness in Denmark is that we have a large public housing sector. We have about 20%, 21% of our housing stock in Denmark is public housing. That's 500,000 units for a population of 5.7 million people. And the access mechanisms are a bit different than here in Belgium. We actually have universal access to public housing in Denmark, regardless of people's income level. Anybody can apply for public housing and be signed on general waiting lists. It takes quite a while to get public housing on these general waiting lists, but anybody can apply. But then, parallel to that, we have a prioritized allocation system so that municipalities have a right within this system to use 1 out of 4 vacancies in public housing. If 100 flats over a period of time becomes vacant because somebody moves out, the municipality has a right to use 25 of these flats for social purposes, an allocation for people in acute housing need. And that is a major mechanism for providing housing for people in acute housing need, and the municipalities have the right to do that based upon discretionary assessment of who need the housing the most. There are usually municipalities, each municipality sets some criteria, but not surprisingly, families with children, homeless families, usually go to the top of this list. There is, of course, a balance between different groups, but especially this system works so that families with children in acute housing need and with social problems can be assigned to housing through this mechanism. So there is kind of 2 layers. First of all, a big public housing sector that provide a large share of low-income groups with housing, and then this prioritized system targeting people with social problems in acute housing need, and on a quite large scale. But this system is, of course, not flawless. There are challenges. There is a general supply shortage also of this kind of housing. Even though we have 21% of social housing, it's still not enough. It is also so that people need to be able to pay the rent out of their social benefits. And even though the public housing sector in Denmark is non-profit and only cost-based rent, then the rents in some units are still too high for people on social benefits. So there are challenges in this system, but overall it provides a safety net for families with children and especially for vulnerable families. However, that's how it has been up until this very moment, because what is happening in Denmark just in exactly these months actually, the law took hold in 1st of October this year, just a few weeks ago, is a welfare reform that will lower social benefits for exactly social vulnerable families. Families with children on social assistance benefits will have a kind of cap over their benefits, so that in effect a benefit for instance, a single woman with 2 children would fall somewhat around 200 to 300 euro. So we are in the middle of such a benefit reform that will lower the social assistance benefit for exactly these families, so that it will probably be more difficult for them to afford this housing. And right now there is great concern in Denmark. Will this also cause the same increase in family homelessness that we are seeing in many other countries? So again, an example how welfare systems are dynamic and how these reforms can interfere in these protection mechanisms. There has been a lot of debate about it in Denmark in recent months. However, as I mentioned, the major part of homelessness in Denmark is concentrated not to families, but to single people with complex support needs of all age groups. And it is quite characteristic that a very high share of them have complex support problems in support needs. 80% of homeless people in Denmark have substance abuse problems or mental illness, and a third have both. The high share with substance abuse problems has been quite stable, but we have seen an increase in especially the share of homeless people with mental illness. That has increased from 37% measured in the count in 2009 to 47% in the most recent count. And these figures here are for all age groups, but they are very similar also for the group of young homeless people. That has been increasing. The youth homelessness also widely affect people with complex support needs. But the profile here, that it is mainly single adults rather than families, have of course had an impact on the content of our national homelessness strategy program, that it has mainly been aimed at homeless adults with complex support needs. I will not go too much into detail with this because it takes us a bit more over on the adult homelessness side. But we did a study in Denmark of the profile of shelter users that I think gave some quite astonishing findings. We mirrored it a bit over a study that was done in the US on shelter users in New York and Philadelphia that found out that there were actually quite distinctive groups amongst shelter users. We did a study here on 25,000 shelter users based on administrative data from our shelter system, 25,000 people that used the shelter system, homeless shelter system, over a 10-year period. And what we learned is that we identified 3 different groups amongst the shelter users. The first group are those we could call chronic homeless people. That is homeless people who have not so many, but very long stays in the shelter system. They are actually only 16% of the shelter users, but they consume 60% of all shelter days in this shelter system. And then we have another group that is also quite a small group. They don't use so many shelter days. They are those that frequently go in and out of shelters. We call them the episodical homeless people. And then we have actually, which surprised us a little bit, the largest group is those we can call transitional homeless people. That is people who go quite briefly into the shelter system for 1 or perhaps 2 times for quite a short time, and then they disappear again, and the shelter system never sees them again. We had somehow expected the group of chronic homeless people to be the largest group, but the point is they are, if you take a snapshot of people who are in these shelters at a given time, because they use 60% of shelter days, but are only 16% of users. But just to give a perspective on it, that we did a calculation that over this 10-year period, the shelter system had cost about €1 billion over the whole period. So this small group of chronic shelter users, 4,000 people, have more or less roughly over this 10-year period, 4,000 people consumed shelter stays for about €500 million. That's something like €150,000 each. That's just to give an idea about what is the background and motivation for going into this work with developing a quite comprehensive national homelessness strategy. And a bit on this strategy. The first part of it ran from 2009 to 2013. It was quite well funded, with €65 million provided from the central government. Already back then, we could see these emerging results from especially the US, but also from another Nordic country, namely Finland, that the housing first looked to be a quite promising approach. There were good results coming out of randomized studies in the US, and Finland had just adopted a homelessness strategy based on housing first. So I think we were a bit lucky that the Danish government decided that the whole strategy should have housing first as its overall principle already back then in 2009. And the idea was to test whether housing first works in a Danish context. Now, you know, the basics of housing first is that we should not first make people housing ready before they are housed. Housing should not come in the end of a long course of interventions. We should provide the housing as soon as possible and with sufficient social support attached to it so that people can actually succeed in becoming housed. And to do so, we also know from the literature that we need to use stronger social support methods than we usually do, namely to use more evidence-based, systematic and more intensive floating support methods, and they go under the names assertive community treatment, intensive case management, critical time intervention, developed in an American context. And we decided that the Danish homelessness strategy should widely try to develop housing first based on these support methods in a Danish context. 17 municipalities out of 98 participated in this first part of the program, representing more than half of the Danish homelessness population. And then the results were very promising, so it was decided to make a follow-up of the program, a follow-up that ran from 2014 to 2016 that had a focus on trying to mainstream housing first from these projects into the general welfare, local welfare systems in Danish municipalities. And then, because of this increase in youth homelessness, it was also decided to develop a separate youth homelessness program. Now, as I mentioned, this was quite ambitious, and we were probably helped quite a lot with implementing such a relatively large-scale housing first program by this allocation mechanism to public housing that I mentioned earlier in my talk, because this has been the main way of providing housing for these housing first programs on a local level. Municipalities, as I mentioned, have this right to allocate 1/4 of vacancies in public housing to people in acute housing need, and they widely decided also to use this mechanism to provide housing for these housing first programs. And you may say that in this way, this prioritized access system to public housing kind of worked as an institutionalized mechanism to provide housing first, to provide housing for these programs. It's much more difficult if you don't have such mechanisms available in your general your general housing systems. And then the support, we developed these floating support methods, intensive case management, assertive community treatment, and critical time intervention in a Danish context. They were kind of imported from the US context and American context, and people were a bit skeptical. What can we use social methods from the US for? They have an ocean of homelessness in the US. What can we learn from the US? But the point is, these programs had been quite rigorously tested in the US, and we could see on these tests that when you use them in combination with this housing first principle, then a very high number of homeless people with complex needs can actually be rehoused and stay housed. So even though that in the US they cover only a fraction of their homeless population, it is more the results for those people who get them that were so promising that we decided to implement and test these methods in a Danish context. And the point is, again, to provide very tailor-made social support around the individual, coordinating services, giving support, both social and practical support in daily life, and help people cope with their everyday living and enable them thereby to maintain their housing despite their complex support needs. Now, the results from this program were very positive. We could see that even when we look at these single homeless people with complex support needs that are the homeless people in Denmark. Housing First worked for these people with complex support needs also in a Danish context. We did not use a fancy randomized controlled trial in these studies. We used an ordinary outcome measurement and looked at how many of the people who went through the program stayed housed. There were about 1,000 people who went through the program, and 9 out of 10 of them roughly stayed housed during the period we observed. And that is in line with the findings from other countries that has tested Housing First. I know you've also had model projects of Housing First here in Belgium, and these were really positive results. And I think we learned that many of these homeless people who fall through, so to say, the ordinary safety net in this Scandinavian welfare state, I think it was an eye-opener that they don't need to be homeless. We can actually get these people out of homelessness if we use these more intensive and systematic methods to provide them with both housing and support. And as I mentioned here on the slide, I mean, people whom we never thought could have been housed were housed, and we could not in advance predict who would those 10% be who would fail. So that also very much speaks for making Housing First, so to say, the first line intervention for this group. And then you should, of course, also have alternatives for those who do not succeed in maintaining their own housing. Another finding was that we had better experiences, I think, with independent housing out in the public sector than these more congregated housing facilities that you also often find in the field of homelessness, where you gather homeless people in like an apartment block together. This model of spreading people out in the ordinary housing stock seemed to be the better model. This actually worked when we used these more intensive methods. So this was a very positive learning when it comes to the main target group of homelessness in Denmark, namely homeless adults with complex support needs. There were, of course, also many challenges. Indeed, this transition to Housing First needs a major mind shift in many sectors. Housing First needs to be facilitated, so to say, amongst all the local actors that are involved in such a process: service providers, shelters, municipalities, and especially also in the adjoining treatment centers like the substance abuse treatment services, etc. So a major mind shift is involved in transitioning to Housing First. And it is still debated. There is still tension between the Housing First and the Housing Ready, or the Treatment First model, also in Denmark. And we also learned that, I mean, you need not only to focus on these smaller model projects that we also had in municipalities, you need to work on the broader organizational structures in municipalities to kind of scale up and mainstream this into general welfare services. And I think one of the barriers is that although we had quite a large program, we still have a challenge with scaling up these more intensive evidence floating support methods, evidence-based floating support methods in Denmark. They don't cover the whole target group yet. And then we, of course, also have a general shortage of affordable housing. As I mentioned, even though we have a big public housing sector, we still have scarcity problems. And then, as the final challenge, this problem that general welfare policies sort of counteract these initiatives. First, they did so for the young people, and now we are very concerned that reductions in benefits also for families with children can actually jeopardize some of these programs and principles. But as I mentioned, homelessness in Denmark has been increasing over this period, so there are some paradoxical results in this. Can a homelessness program be regarded as successful when homelessness at the same time increases? I think it's very important here that we don't confuse the results on individual level with those on aggregate level. These methods work very well for the people who receive them, but they cannot solve this general emerging housing affordability crisis and counteract the consequences of the welfare reforms I mentioned before. So you might say a bit critical that there is a certain detachment of general homelessness policies or of homelessness policies from general housing and welfare policies. But now I just, at the end of my talk, want to debate a bit, because today we've mainly talked about family homelessness and youth homelessness. And a big question here is, of course, can the principles of the Housing First model be extended also to cover young people? Is it a promising method also for young people? And what also about the homeless families that are now emerging? We did not have a specific focus on homeless youth as such in the first program. There were homeless youth going through the first part of the Danish program too, and it looked on the results as if Housing First worked fairly as well for the young people if we managed to get them housed, but the big challenge was more to provide the housing for them due to higher affordability barriers. And especially we also learned that many of these young people that it was actually quite beneficial for them to go out into independent housing, like a small one-bedroom apartment or a small youth housing flat, rather than to gather them in more group home-like settings where we often maintain an environment, we create an environment that maintains their social problems rather than enable them to a recovery process. So we had good experiences on the Housing First program, on the Housing First model in the first stage of the Danish program, but it was not systematic enough, and therefore we decided also that the youth homelessness program that was part of the second stage of the Danish strategy should also be based on Housing First, with the use of ICM and CTI as support methods. So what we learned is these homeless youth, they also have complex problems. They need both housing and support to facilitate their general recovery and kind of try to reconnect them both to their families and also to education and employment programs. But as I mentioned, the housing affordability issue is a separate challenge for this youth homelessness program. It is running right now and we are getting in results. But what we hear is that although the model as such seems promising, it is still to get the housing for it that is the big challenge. So I would say Housing First also looks as a very promising model for young people. Now, with homeless families, I think we need just a little rephrasing of the concepts. I would probably there choose to talk about housing-led approaches for housing for homeless families. Housing First is kind of a particular model where we also emphasize this strong social support linked through these evidence-based methods. If a homeless family has complex support problems, they obviously also need such kind of support. But if they have less extensive social problems, they might also do with a bit less support. But first of all, you could say that all homeless families with children need housing as soon as possible. It is a very traumatic situation for children to be in a homeless situation, and I think it is very important that we take a very careful look at our housing and welfare systems to see if they are able to generate the amount of housing, so to say, that is necessary for these homeless families. And it is a very complex mechanism. There are no quick fixes to this emerging problem, but we can say that we should have a careful look at our housing and welfare systems, whether they have the structure that enables the provision of sufficient housing for these homeless families. So I would say just at the end of my talk, like perspectives and recommendations overall, that I would highly emphasize the need to continue to mainstream Housing First into the general welfare system. We have very good experiences with it in Denmark, and I would also recommend it for other countries. I would also emphasize the importance of both addressing the support component. We need to be aware that Housing First is based on quite systematic evidence-based provision of social support through quite specific methods. Otherwise, it's not Housing First. And then, of course, we need to continue efforts to increase the supply of affordable public or social housing. I think it goes for almost all European countries at the moment. And I would say that for literally all groups of homeless people, both single adults with complex needs, homeless families, and homeless youth, Housing First or housing-led approaches should be the first-line intervention. They are a condition for creating a stable situation for these people and to facilitate more general recovery for all the many social problems that these people often face. Thanks.
Many thanks, Lars. As mentioned before, we have some time left for questions. So if there's anyone who... Yeah, Koen. Well, we have a mic.
Thank you, Lars, for this excellent lecture. I really enjoy it. And hopefully you will be back soon. In Belgium, you deserve a much bigger crowd of people working in homelessness services. I have one remark and one question. My first remark is with regard to the social assistance benefits. And I think you raise a very important issue, namely the level of social assistance benefits. And when I compare it to what we have in Belgium, we see that the leefloon is very low. And also we didn't make any decisions with regard to child benefits and to bring in the poverty perspective. So I think this is a very important issue you bring into the debate of homelessness, the effect of welfare state measures and the level of social assistance benefits and also other social security benefits. But my question is with regard to the floating supports, and you already raised it at the end of your talk. You say housing first is housing first, and we can't, how do we say, broaden the method. It's housing first or it's not housing first. And at the same time, you're making the link with assertive community treatment, intensive case management, critical time intervention. Can you tell a little bit more on these specific methods, how they work, and also the link with housing first? Because my impression is, based on your talk, that there's a lot of conditions on these types of methods. You really need to follow these methods. The housing is conditioning on the methods. So how does it work? What kind of people do this kind of work? What do they do? And how does it work in practice?
It is very important to emphasize that housing first is not housing only. It is a combination of an early housing solution and then intensive social support that fits the support needs of the homeless people. And they may of course diverge. Some people have very complex needs and some have less complex needs. And the general learning is that when we started these methods in Denmark, many people said, but we are doing that already. We are housing people, but often it doesn't work. And then when you get a bit deeper into it, you ask, but what kind of support do you provide? Then the picture showed that either they provided support of a quite low intensity, like a visit every second week. Perhaps they were not very careful in following up. If the person did not open the door, they quickly ended the support. And often people got no support when they were housed. And the learning of housing first is that you need a much more intensive and systematic approach to the group with complex needs. And that, in our case, with the profile of Danish homeless people, goes for a very high share of the group. Not only the homeless adults, but also homeless youth. The young people have very complex support needs, and they need the same kind of intensive social support. So it was a learning we need to do this support differently in a much, much more systematic way and follow these evidence-based methods. There had been a long process of developing and refining these methods. The ACT model is probably the strongest for those with the most complex support needs. That's an intervention where you do not only have one support worker, you have a multidisciplinary team that consists of both the social support workers, a psychiatrist, an addiction treatment specialist, a nurse to take care of physical problems that can flexibly come out and give the support in the homeless person's new home. This is a very strong model, but not all homeless people need this intensive support. So for some, we can do with intensive case management, which is more like one support worker that gives the daily social support and then reconnects people to other services they need. But it's still more intensive than what we usually do. We already had a mobile floating support system in Danish municipalities, but it was typically of this somewhat much lower intensity of support. So this has been a basic part of this transition. And our experience is that it is needed for almost all the homeless people we have in Denmark.
Any other question? Lee.
Lars, I'm wondering, you're saying that it's really a program for complex men, may I say men?
And women.
And women. And were there also any fathers, and were some in the background children involved or not? Or
Yeah, I mean, many of these homeless men also have children, but they don't have custody over them. And for them, it's very, very difficult to see their children and maintain any kind of stable relation with their children as long as they are in an acute homeless situation and staying in shelters. So what we also learned was, I think, a quite important finding in the more qualitative part of the evaluation was that many of these homeless men were better able to reconnect with their children when they got a flat and they got the support. Even though it was a small flat, it provided better facilities for having their children that usually lived with their mother come over and visit. And then, of course, for women with children, of course, it's obvious that they need also the housing solution very immediately. But again, the main part of the homeless people in Denmark are single men, and then also single women, a smaller group. But these are the two main groups, and very few families. So yeah.
Ik kijk even rond. Leen Volhard.
Sorry. In the report, we are asking if it would be possible to for women and children, and then especially women with complex problems, that they already a psychiatrist is involved. They take medication. There has been a history of violence, so when you talk to those women, you see that they are in a big need. And I was wondering if it would be possible to give them also a housing first, because you can really see that they need a lot of counseling and support, but they are also eager to start their own private life.
And I think that's all the things that comes within some reach when you turn things upside down and provide people with housing as soon as possible. Then it becomes possible. People begin to get a little bit of ontological security and start being able to work on other problems in their life. I mean, whatever it is, a woman with children or a young homeless person, 19, 20 years old, this having no place to live, this instability causes a great amount of stress, and it's almost impossible to work with any other social problems as long as they are in this acute homelessness situation. And that is the critique against this treatment-first approach, where housing comes at the end of the intervention, so to say, or later, that you need to provide it much sooner. And I think Again, in the Danish context, the municipalities would step in very quickly if there is a woman with children in a homeless situation. It's not always possible, as you see on the numbers, but the overall priority is that they would have very high priority in this allocation system, and then they would be they would receive some kind of quite intensive social support also from the municipality. And when there are children involved, that would typically involve family therapy. That would be a psychologist often involved, and perhaps also a psychiatrist. I think in those projects here that I talked about, we also learned that it was quite important to have a psychiatrist involved, especially for this group of adult homeless people with complex needs. Many of them have mental illness, and having the psychiatrist on board in a team was quite important. But that was also often the challenge, because we didn't have that in the ICM part of the program, which was the largest part of the program. And there was this struggle that we needed this psychiatric component. Then you need the linkage to the psychiatric treatment system, and there it begins to become difficult. So the more you can get a psychiatrist on board in these teams and these support constructions, probably the more successful they will be.
Heel kort, Koen, als het kan. Ja.
Maybe something about this morning we were discussing the prevention of evictions, and especially the situation of families with children. You didn't say much about the Danish approach to the prevention of eviction. What are the experiments in Denmark to prevent evictions?
That is a very good question, because people often think that in this Scandinavian welfare state we have very strong protection mechanisms against evictions. And we haven't actually. We have some of the strictest eviction laws in Europe, and that is kind of a price we pay to have this broad public housing system. And this whole public housing allocation mechanism is that it needs also the housing associations need to have the possibility to evict people when things goes wrong. So that is goes wrong, and that is kind of a balance. We actually have quite strict eviction procedures, but we have quite, I would say, intensive prevention measures. We had a program also trying to prevent evictions in Denmark that was very much based on the same principles as Housing First, this kind of providing this kind of floating support for people who are at risk of eviction. There also, I should mention again, besides this program, we have a much broader mobile support teams going on, operating already in municipalities, and they would often provide support to this broader target group who are at risk of eviction. So a lot of emphasis has been on preventing evictions in Denmark, actually also because we saw an increase in evictions over a number of years, and when this intervention programs against evictions, also scaling up these preventative support methods was set in, then the eviction curve went down again. So, yeah.
Mevrouw. Ja. Naima.
Hello, I'm Brigitte Houtman from a refuge house here in Brussels. I do want to play, I don't know how you say it in English, advocaat van de duivel, lawyer of the devil, because in Brussels, Housing First, we hear it last years often and often, and I do want to say that there is perverse sides to it. In a city where there's already so little housing, Housing First is a good thing for a small population or small part of the homeless population, but it keeps on coming forward as the miracle solution. So, I'm pro it, I'm not saying, but we do need to not make it like the miracle solution. I do believe that refuge houses or maison d'accueil, opvanghouses, are still useful also for certain publics. You said earlier on, there are people who need large support. I think it's always also perverse to think that housing first people are obliged to have that support. People who go into housing first are not allowed to say at one point, sorry, I don't want all your help anymore. And so, there are other sides to it as well. Sorry, I just want to get that.
Well, we actually did a user survey amongst shelter users in Denmark, and 90% of them said that they would like to have their own housing, and about 70% of them wanted their own flat. So this probably also is also what the majority of homeless people want. But it's clear that in a situation where you cannot get the housing, then you can get critical. It's in my way, it's a bit a misinterpretation to conclude that then the housing first model doesn't work. It's more the conditions for implementing a housing-led approach and housing first approach for those with the highest needs. That is a challenge there, but then you should probably mainly address the focus out into the more general housing and welfare policies and look at, for instance, this increasing gap between benefits and rents, for instance. So it's that would be my approach.
Okay, thanks again, Lars. Beste mensen, het is 4 uur, we zitten perfect op schema. Ik vermoed dat u stilaan wat moe begint te worden. Dat is ook zeer logisch, want we hebben vandaag al heel veel input gekregen. Maar wij vonden toch dat we deze studiedag op een waardige manier moeten afsluiten, of moesten afsluiten. En we zijn dan ook heel blij dat professor Bernard Hubeau van de Universiteit Antwerpen, die tegelijkertijd voorzitter van de Vlaamse Woonraad is, bereid is om op onze studiedag een slotreflectie te presenteren. Bernard Hubeau, u heeft gezien in ons dossier dat wij in het voorwoord heel wat mensen bedanken. Waarom? Omdat dit dossier nooit tot stand was kunnen komen zonder de hulp, zonder de steun van al deze mensen. Nu, een van de mensen die ons van in het begin sterk ondersteund heeft, is professor Hubeau. En ik wil hem dan ook heel graag het slotwoord van deze dag geven.
Goedenavond, goedemiddag nog, dames en heren. Wat valt er nog te zeggen na zo'n rijk gevulde dag? Het is gevraagd en ik zal het ook doen. Voor eerst dank voor het mooie rapport, de mooie studiedag. Strak getimed en de opportuniteit om ook een beetje als voorzitter van de Vlaamse Woonraad, maar ook als persoon toch enkele reflecties te kunnen geven, vooral op het deel beleidsstappen voor dak- en thuisloosheid. Ik lees het even voor, met oog voor kinderen. Dus haakjes, ik vind het ook goed dat er, ook al is het de kinderrechtencommissaris, dat in het rapport naast het woord kind ook altijd het woord jongere wordt uitgesproken. Waarom? Ik denk dat we, als we denken aan kinderrechten, dat we dan heel vaak kleine peuters voor ons zien. Moeten die veel recht hebben? Dat is toch niet zo belangrijk. Nee, het gaat eigenlijk om kinderen en jongeren. En ik denk dat dat goed is dat we die beide altijd samen nemen. Wat ik met u wil doen, is eigenlijk een paar losse bedenkingen, losse reflecties doornemen. Maar ja, wat is het woord los? Het klinkt alleszins beter dan vast. Hè. Vaste reflecties of vastgeankerde, vastgeroeste. Het zijn geen echte conclusies, het zijn een aantal reflecties. En ik wil ook even Paul en David van de Vlaamse Woonraad bedanken voor de input. Het is een gezamenlijk product, maar ik zal het woord voeren. Hè. In verband met het rapport. Goede wijn behoeft geen krans. Veel spreekwoorden kloppen, maar dit klopt niet. Hè. Want je mag en je moet, wanneer er goede dingen geproduceerd worden, moet je daar ook reclame voor kunnen en durven maken. En ik denk dat de grote meerwaarde van dit rapport vooral schuilt, jullie weten dat, in dat luik, naast de andere luiken ook, dat belevingsonderzoek. Hè. Dat is eigenlijk toch vrij uniek in Vlaanderen. En dat men eigenlijk, in geleerde woorden klinkt, dat het narratieve, wat mensen vertellen, dat eigenlijk aan bod komt op een heel specifiek onderwerp. En we hebben heel veel studies, te weinig nog, hè, maar over het grote woononderzoek en heel wat cijfers. Maar de verhalen die erachter zitten zijn heel belangrijk. Het tweede pluspunt is, er is heel veel aansluiting wat de beleidsvoorstellen betreft met activiteiten en voorstellen van wat diverse woonactoren voorstellen. In plaats van het warm water opnieuw volledig zelf te willen uitvinden, hebben jullie ook aansluiting gezocht bij, ik geef maar een voorbeeld, adviezen van de Vlaamse Woonraad, het Steunpunt wonen, maar ook gedragenheid in de hele welzijnssector, denk ik, en de jeugdsector. Het zou contraproductief geweest zijn om dat niet te doen. En ik vind het, om maar één voorbeeld te noemen, interessant en leuk om te lezen, dat een oud idee van de Vlaamse Woonraad om een woonrechtcommissaris te creëren, een soort brugfiguur die eigenlijk het recht op wonen zou moeten bewaken en daar ook een stuk controle is veel gezegd, maar toch een zekere rol in kon spelen. En de eerste reactie zou zijn, jij had het kunnen beschouwen als een concurrent. Hè. Nee, het wordt als idee terug opgenomen, gewoon om te kijken of het recht op wonen in de toepassing van het woonrecht in Vlaanderen, of dat effectief toegepast wordt en effectief is. Dus dat idee is niet helemaal weggeëvaporeerd. Hierboven hadden ze daar veel minder sympathie voor, maar dat is denk ik ook wel belangrijk. Het rapport brengt dus heel wat voorstellen om aan de soms problematische situaties waarin kinderen en jongeren verkeren, oplossingen te geven die het recht op wonen dichterbij kunnen brengen. En dat is denk ik de centrale boodschap die hieruit voortvloeit. En ik breng even een citaat van zeker Albert Camus, dat is een... Ik weet niet of jullie... Dat is een Franse auteur, die belangrijkste werken, L'étranger en La Peste. En die zegt eigenlijk iets heel moois. Ce n'est pas la souffrance de l'enfant qui est révoltante en elle-même, mais le fait que cette souffrance ne soit pas justifiée. Uiteraard zijn beide elementen van die uitspraak correct. Het eerste is la souffrance. Ja, je moet dat woord zien in de tijdsgeest. Hè. Het lijden zelf van kinderen en jongeren appelleert ons, bevreemdt ons, bijvoorbeeld in situaties van oneenigheid van de ouders, van onbeslistheid, van gebrek aan politiek wil om de situatie van kinderen en jongeren te verbeteren. Maar aan de andere kant is het feit nog veel zwaarder, zegt Camus, dat dit op geen enkele wijze kan verantwoord worden. En centraal in de paar overwegingen die ik nog ga geven, is dat omwille van het kind en het jongere zijn, zij recht hebben op een stuk maximale stabiliteit. We spreken heel vaak over woonzekerheid, werkzekerheid, rechtszekerheid, maar ik zou eigenlijk het begrip ontwikkelingszekerheid willen introduceren. Jeugdzekerheid, eigenlijk dat je niet enkel zekerheid hebt in dat banden, bijvoorbeeld gezinnen waar het echt niet meer gaat, dat niet per se aanhouden, maar wel ondersteuningszekerheid. Hè. Dat een kind, een jongere kan rekenen op ondersteuning en dat is een vorm van zekerheid. Het kind en kinderrechten het jongeren- en het jongerenrechtenperspectief in het woonrecht is niet zo gebruikelijk. En daarom is deze studiedag ook wel zeer nuttig. En het rapport zeer nuttig, omdat beleidsnota's en regelgeving in zaken wonen gaat meestal uit van het begrip huishoudens. En we tellen het aantal huishoudens, bijvoorbeeld om het aantal sociale woningen, de behoefte aan sociale woningen te berekenen. En eigenlijk binnen die huishoudens, dat zijn diverse samenstellingen. En kinderen en jongeren zijn daar een deel van. Maar de specifieke aandacht voor die delen van die ruimere entiteiten, individuen, is eigenlijk minder aanwezig. En dat is toch een terechte opmerking, omdat het element zeker ook in het advieswerk van de Vlaamse Woonraad, die vooral op woonbeleidsinitiatieven reageert, om die dimensie van apart is te denken van, ja maar het gaat niet meer enkel om de volwassenen, maar ook om de kinderen. En dat is een van jullie vragen, om dat perspectief in te brengen in woon- en welzijnsbeleid. En ik denk als we zoeken naar een toetsingscriterium, hoe we de vraag dan stellen van komt het overeen met de verwachtingen van kinderen en jongeren, dat daar dat oude, maar heel belangrijke concept van het belang van het kind opnieuw centraal moet worden gesteld. Sommigen zeggen dat is een veel te vaag begrip. Ja, maar let op. Vage begrippen hebben enorme voordelen. Dat is dat ze kunnen worden toegepast in concrete situaties. En dat is de grote kracht daarvan. Ik vergelijk het een beetje met het begrip dat heel nauw erbij aanleunt. Menselijke waardigheid is ook zo'n richtinggevend begrip dat eigenlijk een toetsingskader biedt om in concrete situaties dingen te beoordelen. Het rapport van het KRC, goede wijn, krijgt hier veel kransen, maar terecht heeft tevens de verdienste dat het beleid in zaken dak- en thuisloosheid wordt gekaderd in een ruime context. Het heeft oog voor structurele oorzaken, linken naar armoedebeleid, schuldenproblematiek. Het gaat heel ver. Het is een warm pleidooi ook voor niet verkokerd, samenhangend Vlaams en lokaal beleid. In het debat van vanochtend is dat herhaaldelijk aan bod gekomen. Federale, Vlaamse, lokale input is belangrijk. Maar soms lijkt dat toch wel te botsen, die oproep met de bestaande bestuurspraktijken, omdat samenwerking tussen bestuursniveaus in dit land van wat we noemen multilevel governance, meerlagige bestuursvormen, dat toch niet evident is. Natuurlijk, daardoor gaan jullie voorstellen wel zeer breed. En ik denk dat in de komende maanden er wellicht een stuk relief zal komen in de verschillende voorstellen. Het zijn er zeker meer dan 100, ik heb ze niet geteld. En dat relief van wat is prioritair en wat niet, zal een meerwaarde betekenen. En beleidsmakers zullen, wees er gerust op, daar de nodige voeding uithalen. In die zin is het ook een beetje een work in progress nog, om te zien wat men eruit haalt en waar ook beleid gaat rond gevoerd worden. Het is een breed palet aan voorstellen. Het gebruik van een specifieke invalshoek, kinderrechten, heeft ook mogelijk enkele nadelen. En het is een open vraag, maar wordt in het rapport misschien in een aantal gevallen niet te snel de kaart getrokken van een doelgroepspecifiek beleid? Ik verklaar me nader. Er wordt gepleit voor een aantal heel goede dingen. Het meer zichtbaar maken van de kinderen in statistieken over dak- en thuisloosheid, een versterkt woonrecht voor de kinderen. Maar wanneer je de vragen en eisen in zaken dak- en thuisloosheidsbestrijding specifiek voor kinderen en jongeren bekijkt, zou je de indruk kunnen krijgen dat het dak- en thuisloosheidsbeleid voor de volwassenen wel oké is. En dat er eigenlijk een soort onderscheid is tussen de volwassenen en dan de kinderen en jongeren die daardoor benadeeld zouden zijn. Laat ons even een kat en kat noemen. In mei 2004 keurde het Vlaams parlement in spoedbehandeling een resolutie goed betreffende de Vlaamse strategie tegen dak- en thuisloosheid. We zijn 12 jaar verder, we zijn 3 legislaturen verder en heel veel concrete maatregelen zijn er genomen. Ik zou bijna durven zeggen kleinere ad hoc maatregelen, maar een globale strategie tegen dak- en thuisloosheid is nog steeds in de maak. Nu, eind dit jaar is er sprake van dat die Vlaamse strategie toch zou worden uitgewerkt. En we kijken daar hoopvol naar uit. En hoop met de Vlaamse Woonraad dat er ook eventjes naar ons advies zal gekeken worden. Maar we denken dat dat wel zal gebeuren. Deze algemene bedenking betekent niet dat binnen een generiek beleid in zaken dak- en thuisloosheid dat er toch bijzondere aandacht kan zijn voor kinderen. Integendeel, er zijn daarvoor algemene redenen en ook specifieke redenen in het licht van dak- en thuisloosheid en het beleid daar rond. Eerste algemene. Nu is het een beetje filosofischer. Ik denk dat wonen echt een specifieke existentiële kwestie is. Dat is meer dan heel veel goederen en diensten waar we gebruik van maken dagelijks. En het heeft zowel rechtstreekse als onrechtstreekse gevolgen op de personen die wonen. Rechtstreeks is bijvoorbeeld de bevochtigheid van een woning die de gezondheid rechtstreeks aantast. Onrechtstreeks dat bijvoorbeeld slechte isolatie, dat die leidt tot hoge rekeningen voor de energie en daardoor stress brengen, schulden, ook voor jongeren en kinderen in kluis. Dus de impact van de woonomstandigheden op de ontwikkeling van kinderen is enorm. Het is eigenlijk wonen is een wezenskenmerk en het was ook een beetje in die gedachtegang dat Albert Camus, een Franse auteur die u misschien kent, zijn hoofdwerken waren L'étranger en la peste, die schreef ooit L'homme que je serais si je n'avais pas été l'enfant que je fus. Dus eigenlijk uw jeugd, we kijken best naar onszelf, hoe bepalend is uw jeugd voor uw toekomstige ontwikkeling en voor uw volwassenheid. Veel dingen van wat je doet, wat je denkt, wat je voelt in je volwassenheid is gewoon het rechtstreeks gevolg van het bepalend karakter van het kind zijn. En dus wat wonen betreft zijn zowel de woningkenmerken als de gezinskenmerken als de omgevingskenmerken die daarbij een rol spelen. U weet dat Martin Heidegger een zijnsfilosofie voorop stelde. En wonen was voor hem, hij riep eigenlijk op om wonen en zijn quasi gelijk te schakelen. Zijn is belangrijk, de zijnsfilosofie, maar het wonen is eigenlijk even belangrijk als het zijn. Er is zelfs een gelijkheidsteken. Het doet mij ook een beetje denken aan de theorieën van George Herbert Mead, de antropoloog, die eigenlijk zegt, we worden geboren als een persoon, een ik, en we worden een mij. Door de invloeden van de samenleving worden wij I en me. En die mij, daar worden we pas door alle input rondom ons. En het wonen is daar ook een essentieel punt van. Het vormt onze persoonlijkheid, het belemmert soms onze ontwikkeling of het helpt het vooruit. En terecht verwijst het rapport aan naar die vierdubbele kwetsbaarheid. Ik ga ze niet herhalen. En dat lijken mij goede redenen om toch specifieke initiatieven te nemen ten behoeve van kinderen. Ik weet, in de sociale en sociologische literatuur is dat een eeuwig dilemma van gaan we doelgroepgerichte maatregelen nemen en in welke mate en is dat niet goed. En dan zijn er sommigen die zeggen, dan pas ik het even toe op armoede, a policy for the poor is a poor policy. En je zou kunnen zeggen, a policy for the child is a poor policy. Ik denk dat dat sowieso niet te verantwoorden is om van dat standpunt uit te gaan en dat door de kwetsbaarheid van kinderen en jongeren expliciete aandacht en bescherming sowieso vereist en verantwoord zijn. Ik ga naar reflectie 6. Ik verklap niet hoeveel reflecties er zijn, want dan denk ik dat de paniek zou opkomen. Maar om 6:30 moesten we hier sowieso vertrekken, dus de 6e reflectie. Het rapport vermeldt 3 soorten rechten. De protectierechten, de provisierechten en de preferentiële rechten. Ik denk dat deze indeling, die goed aansluit ook bij internationale literatuur, niet enkel over kinderrechten en jongerenrechten, maar ook over sociale grondrechten, een interessant conceptueel houvast biedt. En we zouden dat willen illustreren aan de hand van een 3-tal concrete thema's. 3, zeer kort, die essentieel zijn in de strijd tegen de dak- en de thuisloosheid bij kinderen en jongeren in het bijzonder. En de meeste zijn al besproken. Dat is de preventie en het voorkomen van uithuiszettingen, de nachtopvang, de overgang van de jeugdzorg naar volwassenheid. Eigenlijk mocht er meer tijd zijn, dus na 6:30, dan zouden we dat ook hebben kunnen toepassen op de vluchtelingenproblematiek. Maar het is eigenlijk altijd een combinatie van die 3 types van rechten die je eigenlijk moet gaan gebruiken als houvast om te bepalen of een maatregel zinvol en meerwaarde biedt voor de situatie van kinderen en jongeren. Het eerste was dus de preventieve uitzettingen. Ook in het Vlaams actieplan armoedebestrijding en de conceptnota private huur die donderdag hier besproken wordt in het Vlaams parlement in de commissie Wonen. Daar wordt aan de preventie van uithuiszettingen wel aandacht besteed. Iedereen is het erover eens dat elke uitzetting er 1 te veel is en dat uithuiszettingen maximaal moeten worden vermeden. Er is ook recent uitgerekend, en iemand heeft het vermeld, dat eigenlijk het niets doen tegen het, dat eigenlijk niets doen in verband met de problematiek van uithuiszettingen veel duurder is, maatschappelijk en ook voor de betrokkenen, dan wel iets doen aan de uithuiszettingen en daar dus ook een beleid voor uittekenen. Dat is altijd die mythe dat het sociale interventies per se meer kosten en veel kosten en te veel kosten, terwijl ze eigenlijk maatschappelijke problemen, wat ook een maatschappelijke kost betekent, daardoor reduceren of uit de weg helpen. En de vraag is of er geen scherpere waarborgen moeten worden ingebouwd om uithuiszettingen met kinderen te verbieden of tenminste garanties te geven op een gepaste herhuisvesting. En we zien in de rechtspraak van de vrederechters dat daar een groeiende aandacht is om rekening te houden met de gezinssituatie niet as a whole, maar naar individuen van die gezinsentiteit en dan hun rechtspraak daarop te enten. Of nog, er zou meer middelen kunnen komen naar de preventieve woonbegeleiding en die zou kunnen gericht worden primair op gezinnen met kinderen. En het belang van die woonsituatie op de ontwikkeling van kinderen en jongeren, daar heb ik al iets over gezegd. De nacht- en winteropvang zijn niet geschikt voor kinderen. Stelling in het rapport. Ze bieden alleen bed, bad en brood. Openingstijden zijn niet afgestemd op het kinderleven. En kinderen en hun gezinsleden leven er samen met nak- en thuisloze mensen die soms wel een problematiek hebben. Uit de nulmeting bleek echter dat er meer dan nodig is, toch een beroep wordt gedaan op de winteropvang. Dus ik denk dat het beleid zou moeten stellen dat nacht- en winteropvang totaal ongeschikt is voor kinderen en in de nodige alternatieven voorzien. Ik herhaal maar een voorstel dat ook maar dat mij cruciaal lijkt, omdat dat ook weer samenhangt met die ontwikkelingsmogelijkheden van kinderen, dat je daar probeert zoveel mogelijk te proberen die optimaal te laten verlopen. En ook optimale ondersteuningszekerheid kan bieden. En daar zou de sociale huursector misschien, Björn is net vertrokken, voor noodgevallen iets meer kunnen doen om die gevallen waarbij kinderen betrokken zijn op te vangen. Ik ben aan ik ga het nu toch verklappen, de voorlaatste reflectie. Met het geval Jordi heeft de moeilijke oversteek van de bijzondere jeugdzorg naar zelfstandigheid een naam en een gezicht gekregen. Deze problemen waren eigenlijk al jaren gekend en in diverse publicaties beschreven, ook in beleidsdocumenten. En het Vlaams actieplan armoedebestrijding opnieuw stelt dat geen enkele minderjarige thuisloos mag worden door een gebrek aan begeleiding of huisvesting. En alleen door een consequent beleid te voeren in het woon- en welzijnsbeleid, met dit als uitgangspunt, zullen dergelijke drama's in de toekomst kunnen voorkomen worden. Ook het wegwerken van schotten tussen woon- en welzijnswerk, daar zitten toch nog wel wat schotten. Het zorgen voor vertrouwenspersonen, de aanklampende hulpverlening, aangepaste woningen, noem maar op. De voorstellen zijn bekend. Opnieuw hier voorstellen genoeg. Maar de tijd om in een hogere versnelling te schakelen is eigenlijk aangebroken. En dat brengt ons naadloos bij de 10e en laatste reflectie. En dat gaat een beetje verder weg van het rapport. En dat is het is eigenlijk meer een hypothese of toch iets meer dan dat. Ik vind dat het opvallend is hoe gespleten en schizofreen wij geneigd zijn over jongeren te denken en te praten en ermee om te gaan bij het bedenken van overheidsmaatregelen. Ik verklaar me nader. Soms is de jongere, het kind, een kleine volwassene. Wie vond het woord homunculus, het Latijnse woord homunculus, de kleine mens, weer uit? Ik weet het niet, maar één moet Rousseau of een van die, ik heb het niet meer teruggevonden. Nu, het woord homunculus heeft verschillende betekenissen en wordt zelfs met de alchemie in verband gebracht. Maar soms beschouwen wij de jongeren als kleine volwassenen. En dan denk ik bijvoorbeeld aan het responsabiliseringsdiscours, ik denk aan de gasboetes. Ik denk ook aan een recent voorstel van de enkelband, ook voor jongeren. En dan beschouwen we eigenlijk de jongeren als kleine volwassenen. En in andere situaties, dan goochelen we met het begrip handelingsonbekwaam en rechtsonbekwaam. De laatste klopt niet, maar handelingsonbekwaam. En dan denken we vaak in de plaats van kinderen en jongeren. Zoals dat trouwens ook gebeurt met ouderen. Nu, men zegt al eens, als je zeer oud wordt, dan begin je terug kind te worden. Maar dan zijn het andere geledingen in de samenleving die denken en plannen maken voor kinderen en jongeren. En zijn we dat ook een beetje niet vandaag aan het doen? Opnieuw, meerwaarde van dat belevingsonderzoek in het rapport. Ten tweede, er is ook vaak dat is een eerste vaststelling, er zijn er maar twee, dat we een spontane sympathie en empathie hebben voor alles wat met kinderen en jongeren te maken heeft. En dat is zeer belangrijk, want ze verdienen dat. Maar opnieuw heeft Albert Camus, dat is een Franse auteur, met de twee hoofdwerken L'étranger en la peste, iets heel belangrijk, en ik vind dat dat ook vandaag gewogen heeft, maar in een positieve zin op het hele debat. En ook de oproep van Leen aan zichzelf om sereen te blijven bij het einde van haar betoog. In La Peste, maar dan houdt de vergelijking op, zegt Camus, maintenant je sais que l'homme est capable de grandes actions, mais s'il n'est pas capable d'un grand sentiment, il ne m'intéresse pas. Ik weet dat de mens in staat is tot grote verwezenlijkingen en grote acties, maar als hij niet in staat is om een groot gevoel te uiten en te tonen en te hebben, dan interesseert hij mij niet, de mens. En ik denk dat we de twee moeten combineren. We moeten proberen effectieve beleidsstappen te zetten in richting recht op wonen, richting vermijding van dak- en thuisloosheid. Maar we moeten dat doen ook met aandacht voor de gevoelswereld van kinderen en alle mensen. Er is meer nodig dan sympathie, er is meer nodig dan dat groot sentiment, maar dat is wel nodig ook om die vertaald te zien in de politieke wil om bepaalde maatregelen te nemen. Maar uiteindelijk tellen de effectieve stappen. En mijn hoop is om te zien dat, en vooral jullie initiatiefnemers, om te zien dat over korte of langere tijd van deze voorstellen een deel wordt gerealiseerd. En dan is het toch zeker mede dankzij de studiedag, het rapport en de heel grote steun van het werkveld, zou ik zeggen. Bedankt en ik wens jullie nog een behouden thuiskomst. En de boekjes van Camus zijn allemaal in de folioreeks verschenen aan €5 per titel. Goedenavond.
Dank u wel, professor Hubo. Zoals ik zei, een waardig slot, een waardige reflectie bij deze studiedag. Rest mij eigenlijk alle mensen te bedanken die vandaag gesproken hebben. Kom gerust naar voren, wij hebben nog een cadeautje voor jullie. Dank ook aan u om hier aanwezig te zijn. En ik wil u ook nog tot slot zeer graag uitnodigen voor de presentatie van ons jaarverslag. Dat is op woensdag 16 november om 12 uur, ook hier. Voilà, dat was het. Een behouden thuiskomst en zeer graag tot een volgende keer. Dank u wel.